What's going on? This is Theo Gremminger, aka the OG Fantasy. Welcome to the 2-minute drill. My fantasy reactions from a wild week 11. And this past week was a pretty tilting one. You know, we sit there and we prep for the week. We, look at the guys we want to start. We do I do the waiver wire column. I do the sleepers column. And it got a little wild. I mean, the week started out with Thursday evening and injuries galore. We lose Mark Andrews now for what looks like the season. Harbaugh's talking up how he could come back. I don't buy it. I think it's hope. And sure, if Baltimore makes like the Super Bowl, maybe you'll see Mark Andrews. But for this thing of ours, fantasy football, Mark Andrews is out. And you've got to pivot and you've got to find the next man in. Who that is, it's going to be Isaiah Likely. Charlie Kolar is also going to be in there a little bit, but it's going to be Likely, but I don't have a whole lot of hope. I think if this was last year and this was the Greg Roman offense and you knew you had several weeks of Isaiah Likely, you could bank on that. But I think with, now with the Todd Monken offense, there's going to be another winner with Baltimore. And you got to remember here, Baltimore has a bye week coming up in week 13. So I feel like this is get through the week time against a defense that's very beatable with the Los Angeles Chargers. I think you're going to see a little more Zay Flowers. And I actually think this is an Odell Beckham game. Keaton Mitchell, maybe he sees a little more work. But you got to like Baltimore's chances in this one. Brandon Staley and the Chargers find ways to lose. Baltimore, is going to, I think, figure things out. But there's really no way of recovering from this. Like we talked about Mark Andrews, when you lose a guy like that and you got to go to the waiver wire, it's difficult. If you're a dynasty manager, I think you got to look at pivots. Consider pivoting down from Mark Andrews for a guy that maybe is not as valued in dynasty, but can help you win a title. There's also potential to trade for certain guys, but in redraft leagues, a lot of your redraft trade deadlines have gone by. ESPN's trade deadline is the 29th, but I know Yahoo defaults early this year to like the 19th. If you're in a sleeper league, who knows when your trade deadline is? So if I'm a Mark Andrews manager and I'm in a trading league, I'm going to kick the tires on Cole Kmet. I'm going to kick the tires on Dalton Schultz. I'm going to kick the tires on guys that I think I can get. Logan Thomas, I think, would be a guy that I prefer over anyone on this waiver wire this week, but you're really, really scrambling. But we also lose Joe Burrow, and the Joe Burrow injury fallout is terrible because he's attached to one of the best wide receivers in football in Jahmyr Chase. Now with Jake Browning taking over at quarterback, Google Jake Browning. I mean, it's wild that this is the backup quarterback for Cincinnati, and he didn't look bad, but it's sort of like you have a team that going into the season was a Super Bowl contender in the AFC, and they viewed themselves as such. And you have players like Jahmyr Chase and at, early in the season, T. Higgins potentially in his last year in Cincinnati, and so much riding on Joe Burrow. Then Joe Burrow gets hurt in the preseason, and they don't go out and get a number 2 quarterback that has more experience than Jake Browning. This is a tough one. I think if you have Jahmyr Chase, you got to be really realistic with where you're at. I think Jahmyr Chase is legitimately probably a high-end wide receiver too. He's going to see a ton of volume. He's still Jahmyr Chase, but at the end of the day, the offense takes a big step back. Joe Mixon could be a sneaky winner because Joe Mixon, they might have a little more dump-offs for him, maybe a little bit more work as a receiver, and I think that the offense can't be as wide open as with Joe Burrow. So I'm not really sure how that's going to go, but definitely tough injuries to overcome from with Mark Andrews and Joe Burrow. Devil's advocate is the game we play is a weekly game. So you only need to get through a few more weeks to get to the playoffs, and then the playoffs itself is only a few weeks. So I know that sounds like very dismissive of the impact of these injuries, but that's where we're at. You got to react. You got to keep going and do whatever you can to get your team in a better position for the playoffs. If you're in a trading league, be aggressive on that trading. If you are in a non-trading league, you got to hit that waiver wire. We got to look for guys who can get us through the week. And check out my sleepers article that should drop later this week and a video to accompany it. Now, it wasn't all gloom and doom for fantasy or injuries this past week. The biggest takeaway for me from this week is the continued rise of Tank Dell. Tank Dell is special. This is a guy who's now averaging 16 and a half points per game in PPR, and he is absolutely red hot. Over his last three, 28.9 points per game, 18.9 points per game, and 29.6 points score. I should say points scored. So Tank Dell's given you a 29 pointer, a 19 pointer, and a 30 pointer his last three games. He's just fantastic. And I'll give a shout out to Jax Falcone, aka Scott Bollinger, who hosts a fantastic show called The Undrafted that you can find right here at Player Profiler. He's mentioning he sees some Tyreek Hill in him. And I think at this point, we cannot ignore that. I think when he first came out of the draft process, I think that the bullish argument was he was going to be a Hollywood Brown for the Houston Texans, a guy who is a smaller speed guy who can play outside and play the slot, used in some of those ways we saw Hollywood Brown used early in his career in Baltimore, and also when he had some success in Arizona, especially last year. And you could kind of see that for a third round pick. Dell was 24 years old coming into the season, an older guy, big time producer, but it was at Houston, and a third round pick, not a first round pick or second round pick. This was a guy that was by no means a perfect prospect, but this game has clicked for him, and he is fantastic. He's a big time producer. His skill set is meshing with CJ Stroud and the Houston Texans attack. We've talked about the Houston Texans right here on this video. You know, they're really relying on the wide receiver position. We saw great success with Nico Collins. We've seen 2 great weeks from Noah Brown. He missed this past week, but it's Tank Dell. And I'm not sure that Tank Dell doesn't go down with having one of the better rookie seasons of all time at the wide receiver position. Like, we're going to talk about Puka Nacua shortly, but Tank Dell is averaging 16 and a half points per game. This is more than Jalen Waddle averaged in his rookie season. This is less than Jamar Chase and Justin Jefferson averaged in their rookie seasons. They both were north of 17 points per game. You know, Randy Moss obviously crushed it. He's got the most fantasy points scored of any rookie all time. And then you go with Odell Beckham, who only played 12 games his rookie year, but was ridiculous. Like, he was like 23, 24 points per game. So we're not talking about the best season all time, but when we start ranking rookie wide receiver seasons historically, we cannot have Tank Dell left off. Like, he's probably one of the best at this point. If he keeps this going, he's going to have one of the best 15, 20 rookie seasons of all time at the position. And when you compare him to what Garrett Wilson did last year, Drake London did last year, both of those guys, you know, we talk about Drake London, there were some disappointments last year in the production, but the target share was amazing. And Garrett Wilson was the offensive rookie of the year, and a guy who gained a considerable amount of value in Dynasty. Garrett Wilson, and in redraft, Garrett Wilson, you know, steamed up. And we talk about how special Garrett Wilson's rookie season was. Garrett Wilson's rookie season, he averaged a little less than 13 points per game. Compare that to Tank Dell. Tank Dell's at 16 and a half. Tank Dell has 5 games now with more than 18 points scored in PPR leagues and doesn't show any signs of slowing down. The Tank Dell CJ Stroud connection is real. If you have Tank Dell in Dynasty, it's like found money. We talk about Puka Nacua early in the year, but Tank Dell has certainly come on. And if you have Tank Dell in redraft, I mean, he's a borderline wide receiver 1 right now for the rest of the season, with potential to be like a top 6 wide receiver rest of the season. Talk about Amon-Ra St. Brown's rookie year, where he went absolutely in fuego to end the season. That's kind of where Tank Dell's at right now. Next big takeaway of the week was Justin Fields is back. And that also means that DJ Moore is back. Justin Fields comes back and gives you a Justin Fields game. Gets 169 passing yards and a touchdown, and he runs for 104 yards. So you get the two-way ability. He finishes as a top 8 quarterback on the week. And the great thing about Justin Fields being back is DJ Moore is very much back into the borderline wide receiver one zone. And DJ Moore has had smash games this season with Justin Fields, and this past week was no different. He gets 7 catches, 96 yards receiving, and a touchdown. Both of these guys, I think, are kind of locked in. You also have the fact that the Chicago Bears can't stop anybody. They had this game completely wrapped up, allowed Detroit to come back, and, of course, lose the game. I don't know how long Matt Eberflus is going to keep his job. It seems like they're giving him the season. Doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me today that Brandon Staley and Matt Eberflus are still employed. But hey, man, we're not playing real football here. We're playing fantasy football. And if you have those two guys, you have to be excited. You also have the fact that the running game is completely jumbled. Deonta Foreman is now banged up. You're going to see Khalil Herbert was inefficient, and certainly the matchup didn't help. Detroit is very strong against the run, but Khalil Herbert didn't look that great. Now you have Roschon Johnson's going to get more of an opportunity potentially with Foreman missing. So it's going to be DJ Moore and Justin Fields. And Justin Fields, you have to feel like very excited about, because I think he's going to get more and more opportunities to run, which will also raise his fantasy value. Cole Kmet, also, you got to feel a little bit more confident moving forward. There's consolidation in Chicago. Justin Fields, DJ Moore, feel good about those two guys. So we already talked about Tank Dell. Let's talk about another rookie wide receiver, and that is Puka Nacua. Puka Nacua ends up having the most points he's scored in weeks. I believe this is the most points he's had since week 7. He ends up getting you about 18.5 points this week. Gets a touchdown, 7 targets. But the big takeaway here is you could be looking at early season Puka Nacua. Again, he's trailed off slightly, but now you could start seeing the spike weeks once again, and you could see him being one of the more targeted wide receivers, at least for the next few weeks. Cooper Kupp is dealing with an ankle injury. Cooper Kupp, of course, missed time to start the season, came back, and now he's injured again. We saw how different this Rams offense looked when Cooper Kupp was not there. Puka Nacua was setting records for, some of the most highly targeted games a wide receiver's ever had early in the season with just incredible production. Kyren Williams will be back, should be back this week. And when you look at this offense, if Cooper Kupp doesn't play, I think that you're looking at Puka Nacua with double-digit targets every game the Kupp's not around. Other guys are going to get a little bit of a bump up, and Kyren Williams certainly could come back to a decent role. I actually kind of expect Kyren Williams to be a sneaky play, especially if Kupp doesn't play. But Nacua is the one you want to be really excited about. The enthusiasm for Puka Nacua kind of trailed off a little bit this season, but I think it could be Puka Nacua smashes to end the fantasy football regular season. And if Cooper Kupp can't get going, Nacua could have a big say on the fantasy football playoffs. As we got to talk about Saquon Barkley here. Saquon Barkley smash game. This was his highest scoring game of the entire season. Got you 30 PPR points. And this is the most impactful game he's had since week 2 when he was, 27, 26 points. But Saquon, the exciting thing is not only that the Giants won, showing a lot of pride with Tommy DeVito behind center. They beat Washington and they handled Washington, but it was the reliance on getting Saquon Barkley involved early and often, featuring him. Saquon Barkley ends the game with 5 targets, catches 4 of them, ends up with 57 receiving yards and 2 touchdowns. And then he also adds 80-plus yards as a runner. I think this is a sign of things to come. The Giants are like, Brian Daboll definitely feels the heat. This is not a team. This is a team that made the playoffs last year. I don't think this is let's fire Brian Daboll. Like, there's reports saying that the team has confidence Daboll's going to be back, but I don't quite buy that. I think if the season goes completely south, he's absolutely on the hot seat. Beating Washington, a step in the right direction. This team could have Tyrod Taylor back, but I'm not sure. DeVito has seemed to energize them. They have one more game, and then they're a part of the bye week in week 13. Now, this is a game against the New England Patriots. This is going to be a winnable game, and this is another opportunity for Saquon to smash. I think there's a lot for Saquon the rest of the season. I think that he is a guy who's putting the team on his back. He needs to get a new contract. If you recall, Saquon Barkley has a little bit of a mess of the contract situation. And this coming off season is a big one for him. He could end up being with a different team. He could end up getting another big payday from the Giants, albeit a disappointing one if they franchise tag him. But Saquon Barkley, if he's going to be used like a receiver in this way, with the two-way ability he has, I think he's a 20-plus point per game scorer for the rest of the season. You also have the Darius Slayton injury. The weapons are very limited in New York right now. Darren Waller banged up. Darius Slayton banged up. They don't have the weapons that they can't go full-on Saquon mode. I'm very much looking forward to what Saquon Barkley does in week 12. And then post-bye week, this could be a Saquon Barkley just goes nuts volume-wise for the rest of the season. We talked about the Justin Fields and DJ Moore connection. Another connection that's really, really impressive this past week was the Brock Purdy and Brandon Ayuk connection. Brandon Ayuk goes for over 150 receiving yards, gets a score. Brock Purdy, though, like Brandon Ayuk is incredible. I think if Brandon Ayuk went to a team with a higher passing volume and he was utilized with his 25% or so target share, this is a guy who I think could put up top 5 wide receiver numbers. I think he's an incredible talent, and he meshes well with Brock Purdy. But Purdy, I think there's not enough being said about his potential fantasy impact down the stretch. Purdy passed for 333 yards and 3 touchdown passes. He's had 3 touchdown passes and no picks in back-to-back weeks against Jacksonville and now Tampa Bay. This is post-bye week. Brock Purdy has given you over 600 passing yards and 6 passing touchdowns. And the week before the bye against Cincinnati, he had a disappointing game with the 2 interceptions and also a fumble lost, but he passed for 365 passing yards. So you're talking about 365, 296, and 333 with all of his weapons healthy. They've got Brandon Ayuk, George Kittle, who's also playing great, Christian McCaffrey, who's lapping the field at running back right now for leading fantasy points, and then you've got Brandon Ayuk. So Brock Purdy is playing on the top of his game. You're talking about a second-year quarterback who's putting up these sort of numbers in the second half of the season with fully healthy weapons. If you have Brock Purdy, then be super excited. If you have Brandon Ayuk, be super excited. If you have Christian McCaffrey, you've been excited all season long. And if you're in a trading league, a lot of these teams potentially could have Brock Purdy as their backup quarterback. If you lost to Joe Burrow or you're unhappy with your quarterback's play and you want to go into the playoffs with somebody that you're confident in, go see what you can do about Brock Purdy. And if you're in a dynasty league and people are not valuing Brock Purdy like they should, be aggressive, go make an offer. So we saw an offensive coordinator change this week with Joe Brady taking over in Buffalo. This was kind of a tilting one for people because we had some indecision about the running back volume. We had some indecision about could this be a negative for Dalton Kincaid, who's been red hot. And I think a lot of our concerns were alleviated. Buffalo completely annihilated the New York Jets. Jets are making a change at quarterback finally. I think after getting embarrassed by their divisional rivals who so much changed from week 1 until week 11 in terms of the trajectories of the franchises. But getting back to Buffalo, concerns that a Joe Brady takeover would hurt Dalton Kincaid, I think those go out the window. He has 7 targets, and he continued his streak. The points per game, if you're in a regular PPR league, he's got you about 10 points per game, which was down from his previous 4. But the 7 targets, he now has his 5th straight game with 5 or more catches. Dalton Kincaid is locked in. He has top 3 tight end potential for the rest of the season. And you've got to be really excited about James Cook. He ends the game with 19.2 PPR points. This is tied for his second most on the season. He hasn't cracked 20 yet, but he's had a couple of these 19-point weeks. And he showed you that two-way ability that you really wanted to see when you were drafting him in the 6th round this year in redraft. Cook ends up with 102 combined yards. He ends up with 3 catches, and he scores a receiving touchdown. The James Cook looks like the big winner here from the Joe Brady fallout. He now has back-to-back weeks of 100 or more combined yards. So last week he had kind of that mixed game with the fumbles, but he still ends up with 100 yards rushing. This week you saw the two-way ability. And the other takeaway is, we got a lot out of Gabe Davis to start the season, but this is now 2 straight games where Khalil Shakir has out-targeted him. And this week, Gabe Davis was a fantasy goose egg, drops a 0-pointer when Khalil Herbert has the most yardage he had for the season. So if you've been chasing like the low-end Buffalo receivers, consider Khalil Shakir, not Khalil Herbert. Khalil Shakir ends up, outgaining Gabe Davis and out-targeting him for back-to-back weeks. So Khalil Shakir is in my waiver wire article this week, but Khalil Shakir now has 2 of his last 4 games with 90-plus receiving yards, where Gabe Davis has now had 2 games, which if you put him in your fantasy lineup, he's given you effectively zeros. So there could be a changing in the guard in the pecking order. And I think this is also a big win for Dalton Kincaid. The fact that the indecision with the wide receiver targets is also really, really helping Kincaid, who's sort of a de facto big wide receiver, now becomes the secondary target on the team, unquestioned. Miami had sort of a weird game this week. We thought this could be a potential blowout win over the Raiders, and it was anything but. It was a hard-fought game, and I think that's a testament to the way the Raiders are playing defense since Antonio Pierce took over. They've now had 3, strong defensive performances. This is a Miami offense that, has put up some monster numbers. The last few games, not really as strong in terms of the points. We talk about Kansas City game, over in Germany where Miami really struggled, scored that late meaningless touchdown to even make the score closer, that Mostert plunge at the end of the game. And then this game, they took care of business. I think it speaks to the quality of the Miami team that they got this win in a game where their offense wasn't really clicking. And also they lost Devon Achane to a knee injury early in the game. So we got to talk about Tyreek Hill, though. And this cannot be said, more and more repeatedly. I can't say this enough, that Tyreek Hill, what he's doing is just insane. He's now less than 800 yards away from hitting 2,000. And he ends up with his most receiving yards he's had since week 6. Week 6, he goes nuts, gets 160 plus in that win over Carolina. Then, gets you a couple of weeks where not so great. Get a 60-yard game against Kansas City. He had the game against Philly where played very, very well, but it was, again, less than 100 yards, did score a touchdown. It kind of is funny, when we're criticizing 88 yards and a touchdown, just shows you that, like, Tyreek Hill is ridiculous. He's averaging 21 points per game now in PPR, but the milestone is coming. Like, I think the milestone could come potentially on Christmas Eve against Dallas. I think that would be a very cool one, that Tyreek Hill Christmas Eve goes over 2,000 yards. Right now, again, needs less than 800. And, I don't need to say that he's the league winner at wide receiver. He's certainly right in the mix for it. Ends up with, in the win this week win against Vegas, ends up with 146 receiving yards, gets targeted 11 times, catches 10 of them, and of course gets the touchdown. I mean, how the Kansas City Chiefs and Tyreek Hill couldn't have got it together and had him be a career Chief. I think when the football historians go back and look at Patrick Mahomes and Tyreek Hill, who are going to go down as maybe the best quarterback to ever play the game, and one of the best wide receivers to ever play the game in Tyreek Hill, how these two guys couldn't stay together for their entire careers is something they're going to be talking about like 25 years from now. And the last player I really want to talk about, we could have talked about a ton of guys this week. Keenan Allen would have been a fun one to talk about, but we've talked a lot about him. But I think that when we start looking and identifying this year's league winner at the running back position, certainly if you have Christian McCaffrey, you're feeling great. We talked about Saquon Barkley, a few of these other guys, higher drafted guys that have been very impactful, at least this past week. But the one guy right now who's looking like the league winner to me is Jahmyr Gibbs. And what a arc of a season for him. We talked about in week 4 the disappointment in that Green Bay game, where it was David Montgomery was supposed to miss the game, ends up playing, and David Montgomery goes absolutely nuts. And Jahmyr Gibbs, who a lot of fantasy rankers had pushed way up the list, ends up with only 9 PPR points. There was like a sky is falling type attitude from a lot of fantasy managers. Then, of course, Gibbs deals with an injury, misses some time, has a huge game against Baltimore, like his big breakout game with 27 PPR points. And since then, it's been ridiculous. Gets you a 27-pointer against Baltimore, then gets you a 30-pointer against Vegas, and has followed up after the bye week with a 26-pointer and this past week with 21.5 points. This past week, he gets you a 6-catch game, and he gets you 21.5 PPR points despite rushing for only 36 yards, which is his lowest rushing output since week 2. So Gibbs is locked in. This is a player that I think we're going to be taking in the first round of redraft next year. I think it's pretty clear. This is the next one. This is a player who, when we go into the summertime, fantasy managers are going to say, I need to get Jahmyr Gibbs in my draft. That's it. I'm not leaving this first round without Jahmyr Gibbs. Like, he's not going to be a top 5 pick in PPR, but I think he's going to be the very popular pick, maybe from pick 7 through 12 in that first round next year. Christian McCaffrey will still be the RB1 overall in redraft, but RB2 overall might very well be Jahmyr Gibbs. I think in Dynasty, you're talking about him being a top 2 Dynasty asset at the running back spot with Bijan Robinson. I'd rather have Jahmyr Gibbs than Breece Hall. I'd rather have Jahmyr Gibbs than anybody else in Dynasty when it comes to the running back spot. Bijan would be the only other one. Gibbs is special. He's in an elite offense. He's being featured, and it's actually a dream scenario because if you drafted David Montgomery, you're still getting very good usage out of him. And if you're a Gibbs manager, the presence of David Montgomery actually insulates Gibbs to get these high-value touches like the receiving work. And now he's getting the work around the goal line. He's getting opportunities inside the red zone. We think about Amon-Ra St. Brown's rookie season, how when the season ended, Detroit leans on this rookie. In a completely different sense, that's what this could be with Jahmyr Gibbs. Like, he might not have another game this season with less than 20 points. It's extremely exciting. Enjoy your Thanksgiving. This is one of the best football days of the entire season. We get 3 games on Thanksgiving Day, and then we get a very cool Black Friday game, which is really cool. So this was a pleasure talking to you guys today here on the 2-Minute Drill, my fantasy reactions. Look for my waiver wire video to also drop right here on Player Profiler YouTube. Check out my podcast, First Class Fantasy. We dropped one on Monday with Billy Muzio and I. We had Memphis Young on this week. And check out Dynasty Life. I had Ian Miller on for the 33rd team. And then the end of last week, I had Heath Cummings from CBS. So dropping Dynasty, dropping redraft, churning out content, and loving every minute of it. Want to see you win your fantasy leagues. Want to see you win some cash this year. Get your questions right here in the comments on YouTube, and we're going to do our best to answer them. Enjoy your Thanksgiving. Thanks for sticking with Player Profiler, and enjoy the rest